Hello my dear friends, how are you? I'm Arith Harger and today I'm going to talk about cannibalism in animism. Now I know that the subject of cannibalism may be quite harsh in many conversations. It is after all a taboo in many societies. When we think about cannibalism, we often immediately create a certain idea of a human being eating another human being, or at the very least a species eating the flesh of another of the same species. Indeed, this is an attitude forbidden in most societies throughout human history and goes against many moral principles, laws that secure such moral principles, social behavior and a general understanding of specific ethics that allows the human being to live and coexist within society with other human beings. In general, cannibalism can be easily avoided, as we can see by our societies, as almost no human being is eating another human being, aside from rare specific cases or, historically speaking, in times of great famine. However, the subject of cannibalism isn't that easy to deal with when it comes to animism either, and indeed hard to avoid on a daily basis. Dealing with cannibalism within an animistic society and with an animistic consciousness and worldview, in many cases we are face to face with many paradoxes. In animistic societies, just like in any other society, cannibalism more often than not, it is also forbidden. So there are specific taboos, moral principles, social conducts, etc. to avoid cannibalism. The problem is the fact that within animism, many things of the natural world not only are understood to be alive, but are also considered persons. As I've pointed out on previous videos concerning animism, there's a strong belief, and indeed one of the basic foundations of animism is the belief that that which is alive is considered a person. The world is absolutely populated with persons, and the great majority are not human persons. For today's video, we are going to deal with the persons that have a corporeal existence, live within the world, therefore are alive, have consciousness, have spirit, and are sentient beings. So if we consider animals to be persons, if we eat them, we are eating persons. Therefore, within animism, this is also considered cannibalism. Cannibalism in animism is extended into other realities, and it becomes quite hard to avoid it precisely because of the consumption of animal persons, which are not human persons but are persons nonetheless. So the problem with cannibalism is augmented in an animistic society because by consuming animals we consume persons. And therefore, not only we are cannibals by doing so, but we are also consuming the spirit of another, and all of that is wrong in many ways than what can be immediately perceived if we are not used to an animistic mentality and how such a mentality observes the world and life in it. I understand that many of you may have an immediate stereotypical thought about tribal societies running around, hunting animals, killing animals for consumption, and indeed a great emphasis on a lifestyle that revolves around hunting and the consumption of animals. I think we ought to dismiss as reliable sources of information and knowledge in general about tribal and animistic societies the movies we often see either concerning primitive aspects of human prehistory and most especially how movies portray indigenous peoples of both the past and the present, which more often than not are portrayed with such a savagery that they are almost beasts incapable of a coherent and rational thought. So portrayed quite in the stereotypical manner and in a very derogatory sense, right? So we best forget what movies, TV series and even fictional books have been demonstrating concerning indigenous societies, which in truth is more on the non-indigenous and non-animistic perspective rather than a thorough work of investigation towards the core of animistic societies. That doesn't mean that hunting, domesticating or semi-domesticating animals for consumption isn't real within animistic and indigenous societies. It happens. Of course it happens. However, most animistic indigenous societies that eat animals as their main diet is because they have no other choice due to the natural environment they live in, and nothing can be grown in it save the natural fauna. Also, some animals are seen as powerful spirits or containing a specific power or a specific spirit power the animistic society sometimes needs to propitiate something beneficial within the society itself. And by the instructions of a spiritual leader, let's call it a shaman, just as a general term for a better understanding, well, the shaman specifically indicates which animal is to be hunted and killed and no other, in order to obtain the specific power, spirit or force that the human community is in need of. And a series of ceremonies before, during and after the killing of the animal are conducted. And it becomes more of a ceremonial and magical religious behavior within the animistic society, rather than a case of having the need to kill an animal for the consumption of the meat as a primary means of sustenance. The meat is also consumed in ceremony and shared amongst the community members, obviously, but such occasions are not on a daily basis when other means of sustenance are available, especially of plant nature. Most animistic societies that live in geographical areas where agriculture and gathering consumables from plant sources is possible, they will choose to have a diet mostly plant-based, or indeed downright vegetarian or even vegan diet. We see this in most indigenous communities and animistic peoples and societies of Africa and Asia, in areas where it is possible to do agriculture and have a plant source of food the year round. It's no coincidence that most animists become vegan, and it's no coincidence that veganism has been a way of life in almost every animistic society of the past and present, throughout human history, in places where it is possible to gather and harvest plant foodstuff. And the greater focus on the flora rather than the fauna as means of sustenance. Animism often leads to veganism, and veganism often leads to animism. In this way, it isn't coincidence either the fact that the societies that have a greater predisposition to have a meat-based diet, or whose diet is mostly focused on meat, are non-animistic societies, or societies that have been greatly influenced by religious worldviews that repress animistic worldviews, or indeed animistic societies that have no other choice in terms of food consumption for survival due to their harsh environment, often devoid of natural flora and fertile soils. So, throughout this video I will also touch on the case of veganism, because it is inevitable, not only because the principles of veganism originally developed within animistic societies, but of course when dealing with the consumption of animal and plant persons, we need to speak about veganism. Most of you know that I am vegan. However, in this video I will try to be as impartial as possible to be able to conduct this specific video towards animism. I'm actually not sure how I will develop this, so please, I ask for your patience. We shall develop this as we go. Even in animistic religious terms, there's often the attempt to avoid the consumption of the flesh of an animal person, to avoid having one's own body and spirit corrupted by the angry spirit of the one that wanted to live and was killed. Consumption of souls is a form of cannibalism that greatly affects negatively the body and mind of the persons who consume the souls. And we also must be careful when there's a general assumption concerning animism that everything is alive and everything contains a spirit or a soul. I've talked about this before, so I'm not going to focus too much on that. But indeed, it's important to remember that concerning animism and animistic societies, many things have either been often romanticized or simply made up by several Western scientists who were unable to be impartial and intellectually incompetent to understand indigenous societies due to the fact that such scientists live within societies whose religious worldviews, morals, social conducts and cultures are not focused on the natural world but rather on the dualistic relationship between a God and mankind, where the center of the religious is the individual human being through which the divine works. And everything else is secondary, or indeed unimportant in that type of religious consciousness, leading the person to self-centered acts instead of behaving for the well-being of the broader community and discarding obligations towards the external lives existing beyond the individual. Within animism, not everything is considered alive. Not everything is alive, but many things are. There are a series of behaviors that demonstrate what is alive and what isn't. Also, animism deals with things realistically and sensibly. So there's also often the confusion between spirit and consciousness, which more often than not become synonyms. And I think this is something we should also address, especially in relation to what and who we are consuming. Many things in the world can have a spirit, but that doesn't mean that such a spirit has a conscience and is fully aware of every sense. Also, having a conscience doesn't mean that it is sentient, especially in the sense of the ability to feel. This is important to address because since animals and other beings are considered persons and we eat them, therefore we eat persons and so we are cannibals. However, does that mean that if we eat a plant, we are also cannibals because the plant contains a spirit and may even contain conscience? Well, no, of course not. As I said, animism deals with things realistically and sensibly. It becomes cannibalism, therefore something wrong, a taboo even within animism, when we eat a sentient being, because the sentient being had a full consciousness. That's why it is sentient. It is able to feel, it is self-aware, it is able to perceive its surroundings. Sentience walks hand in hand with physical existence. Bear it with me, please. A plant may contain a spirit and a certain degree of consciousness, but it isn't sentient because its biology and the entire structure of the body in which this plant spirit inhabits isn't developed to the point that the spirit within the plant can feel pain or even be self-aware. On the other hand, let's say a cow is sentient because it has a fully developed, complex and well-structured nervous system which allows the cow to be self-aware and to feel. Therefore, not only the cow has spirit, but also a fully developed consciousness. The cow is sentient, therefore the cow is capable of feeling and of having more complex sensations than the spirit within the plant that inhabits a body that doesn't have a nervous system capable of feeling and without a fully developed self-awareness. And indeed, the sensations of a plant are not as complex as those of a being who has a complex nervous system. Physicality cannot be disassociated from sentience. One thing is having a spirit and maybe even a degree of conscience. Another is having a spirit and having self-awareness and capable of feeling. We cannot simply count with the presence of spirit or signs of conscience. We also have to take into account if it is sentient, if it is capable of feeling, have complex sensations, and if it is self-aware. One thing is having spirit, another is having spirit and also reasoning, the ability to formulate thoughts through feelings and sensations and self-awareness. So, these are a few points I want you to have in mind before we jump into the main subject. I won't delay this any longer, so let's get right into it, my dear friends. Please. So let's start from the point which is the belief that animals are people too. Plants, birds, fishes, and even some rocks are people too. And even the others, the invisible populations of the world. Spirits, land spirits, water spirits, elementals, weather persons, thunder persons, ancestors, deities, etc. Aside from the human person, there are non-human, other than human, and more than human persons. Something I have developed on other videos. The point here is that the world is absolutely fully populated with persons. The great majority are not human. So the question we are addressing here is that if animism in its basis is conscious concerning the respect that one must take towards other persons, and indeed the respect for all life, because other persons beyond the human existence also exist and therefore are worthy of respect, how will a human being satiate its own needs without disrespecting the other persons? For instance, we can kill and eat an animal, but does that mean that we should? What moral principles determine that it's right to kill a pig but not a dog if there's no difference between the two in terms of life and spirit? Perhaps such morals are flawed because they are only determined purely by physical aspect and what is more appealing to the human eye, and what the human being has determined to be of less or more value, turning living beings into objects and property instead of recognizing a life that, as much as us, wants to live and enjoy life. Perhaps the question is also, what gives us the right to kill and consume another that wants to live? Perhaps we grew up with the illusion that we have rights over lives external to us, instead of growing up knowing that it's not rights that we have, but obligations towards other lives, and conduct a life towards an existence that tries to minimize as much harm and damage, and even death, as much as possible. So, is it rights that we have, or the obligation to mitigate our destructive impact in order to survive and live as much as possible, for as long as possible, and let others live? If animals are persons, how can we eat persons? And what are the problems we face in this human-animal relationship when one person becomes our source of food? The first problem we face is how science differentiates humans from animals from plants. Anyone with the wits the gods gave to a turnip can easily see that animals are alive. They are living beings. They are very much like us. They breathe, they consume, they communicate, play, reproduce, are sentient, create their own cultures, their own families, have their own societies. A plant works in the same way, only does certain things differently, but also breathes, consumes, communicates, reproduces, and a few other similar aspects. Science, however, distinguishes animals and plants not by what they are, but by what they can provide to the human being in terms of nutrition. The same is applied to a river or a landscape feature, a mountain, a hill, even the soil itself, not considering spirit, conscious and sentience, but rather what it can provide and how to use in order to extract something to meet the human needs of subsistence. In this view, we focus on the individual and how best to extract everything from our surroundings that will meet our desires, instead of visualizing the lives of those that inhabit the places and the peoples that we want to exploit. So that is the very basis that constructs our morals. Just because we can doesn't mean that we must. There must be a clear boundary between what we truly need to continue on living and what we simply want to exploit solely for self-pleasure. Let's be realistic here. No one, absolutely no one, is exempt of causing harm and damage and suffering harm and damage. From the very moment we're born into this world, we are subject to many dangers from within and without. Any living being is exactly like us in terms of life. We live, we want to live, and we do our best to keep on living. However, every action we take will inevitably and unwillingly, sometimes even unknowingly, cause some harm and damage. The moment a human kills an animal, kills a non-human person, the human being just caused harm, damage, and death. The same thing happens when another animal, like a lion, kills another animal in order to survive. However, is the human a lion? Is the lion a human? No, of course not. They are not the same species. The human being has other abilities and can sustain itself on food sources that are not animal. The human being has the capacity to adapt and evolve and live on by consuming a variety of things the lion cannot. So let's say the human person cultivates, harvests, and gathers fruits, vegetables, roots, mushrooms, etc. Doesn't directly kill an animal in order to consume, to have sustenance and to survive. Is this human with a plant-based diet exempt from causing harm and damage and even death? No, of course not. The very process of cultivating the soils will inevitably kill some smaller animals, insects, can even destroy ants and their colonies, and perhaps even destroy a portion of land, destroying the natural habitat of rodents that will no longer exist there, forcing types of birds to flee because their main food source isn't there. However, we have to measure our impact in everything we do. Like I said, no matter what, our actions have real consequences. The same way an animal's actions to survive will have consequences. But again, we have to measure our actions and the extent of the impact of such actions. We will always cause harm and damage and even death. But the point here is that we can minimize such harm, damage and death. This is the very basis of animism. It's not possible to create a world where there's no kind of harm or damage. And it's not possible to prevent death. What is possible is to create a world where as many lives as possible can live and mitigate as much as possible harm, damage, death and even illness. That's the whole point of both animism and veganism. It's simply not realistic to end all harm and damage. And animists as well as vegans know this, but it is possible to minimize harm and damage as much as possible. Again, it's not a question of our rights over others, but a question of our duties, our obligations towards others. Are we going to overexploit the natural world for our own needs, or are we going to consciously live our lives in order to mitigate the more negative impact we may have in the world and try as much as possible to prevent and to preserve and respect life for our own good, the good of others and the good of future generations? Again, I repeat, no one is free from causing harm and damage and death. Our actions have an impact upon everything. The same way animals' actions and nature's actions will also cause harm and damage and death. But as conscious beings, we are realistic and we know that as much as we try, we are not able to live a life completely free from suffering and causing damage. But we can certainly conduct our efforts in order to mitigate the inevitable damage of our existence as much as possible. Let me pick the previous example of cultivating and harvesting plant foods. We have a stretch of land where we do agriculture. Surely this act alone will inevitably kill some animals that assail the crops, or unwillingly we kill some animals of the soils. However, we can minimize damage and death in various ways. For instance, if ants attack the crops, they do so because they see a good ground for foraging and not consciously aware that this is a human garden. So we can minimize the damage on the crops and avoid destroying many ants by incorporating on the garden aromatic plants, which will force ants to move away, as such plants are natural repellents. Some ants will be confused, lose themselves and die. But most ants gather the knowledge that that place isn't good for them, it has a funny smell, so they will move away. And we saved the crops and the great majority of ants and future ants. We minimized damage, but we are never free from causing harm. On the other hand, the impact is much greater if we go out into the woods and hunt an animal, because that is purposely taking a life. And by taking that life, there's a rupture in the ecosystem. And it's a life that will not be able to reproduce anymore. And its existence is gone forever and will no longer play important roles in the ecosystem that thrives with the existence of that animal. Hunting more often than doing agriculture causes a lot more harm to the ecosystem. Again, neither the farmer nor the hunter are free from causing harm and damage, but the farmer minimizes a lot more harm and damage, most of which is done unwillingly and even unknowingly. We shall see more examples further ahead. Animals are very much like humans, and humans are very much like animals in many important aspects that compose life and the many similarities in behavior, especially in terms of self-motivation, which drives both animals and humans to take action and to carry on living. Animals and humans are persons of the world. Beyond the mere fact of being alive, there are other aspects that mark personhood. Surely, there are differences. For instance, in terms of communication, language, the human ability to communicate reaches levels of complex abstractions that simply do not exist among animals, such as communication through specific written characters and symbols, through the arts, the ability to transform objects and give them functions that are not naturally, originally possible by the objects themselves. However, these are differences in forms of life and not aspects that affirm that something is more alive than something else, or that one life has more value than another. As I said on other videos, what constitutes personhood is something that demonstrates behavior, shows attitude, displays emotion, is capable of interaction, demonstrates self-awareness, expresses a consciousness, and manifests sensibility. Doesn't matter the manner in which these aspects are expressed. What matters is that they are expressed. So, beyond the mere fact of being alive, we must look for signs of personhood, which becomes easier the moment we see the same expression of behavior in anything else as we see in us, instead of looking for the differences and for what non-human and other than human persons can provide. Self-awareness is the most important aspect that constitutes personhood. A person is a living form that is able to relate and communicate. That's what also makes the human being a person. We can relate and communicate. You can relate to an animal and communicate with the animal the same way the animal or the non-human person can do the same with you. A relation is built and can be extended and has impact on other ongoing relationships. We see this frequently in shamanism. The shaman, as a general term, doesn't only engage with spirits in the sense of non-corporeal beings or entities not inhabiting a specific physical form in the world, but also engage with animals, with spirits with a clear physical form that can be engaged with physically. This engagement, this relation, can be for a variety of reasons. To obtain the generosity of the animal, to attain power, to attract something beneficial, or to avoid something dangerous, keeping the animal away or inviting the animal in, and even to eat if it is edible and there is a necessity to eat that specific animal. Engagement. There's also the case that animals are shamans, and I'm not talking about a human shaman shape-shifting into an animal. I'm talking about actual animals who, in their own community, are shamans. Just the same way some humans within the human community can be shamans. It's not the case that all animals are shamans, but some animals are shamans of their own animal community. So the human shaman engages with the animal shaman as well, for a variety of reasons. This is communication, engagement, creation of ongoing relationships not between animal and human, but between persons. But on animal shamans, on some other video. The important thing to understand here is that there is engagement between persons of different species, but being of different species doesn't indicate that ones have more personhood than others. This engagement creates a sense of responsibility for the well-being of those who inhabit the same spaces of existence. Again, persons relate and communicate, so the human and the non-human relate and communicate amongst themselves and with each other, creating relationship, understanding, reasoning, formulating the need to be responsible for the well-being of the persons involved in the ongoing relationship. A non-human person has its own responsibilities within its own community and its own laws and rituals, and this sense of responsibility of working towards the well-being of that community is also shared by human persons who also have their own responsibilities and laws and rituals in their own communities. The responsibilities within each community of persons is shared because persons communicate and relate. So the need to act towards well-being is extended and crossed with the needs of others. Thus, all actions have a relation and must be measured, not only taking into consideration the well-being of our community, but also the well-being of other communities, of other persons who also act towards well-being, be those human or non-human or other than human persons. The latter including spirits of place, land, rivers, mountains, elementals, weather, etc. We humans as persons perform actions towards other humans, but also towards animals and landscape features. A good example of that are pagans, who engage with animals and the landscape itself, just like animists and animistic pagans. An ongoing relation with the surroundings. In the same way, animals perform actions towards humans. If animals are persons, they too are self-aware, self-motivated, and have purpose. So they will engage, they will relate, and they will communicate amongst themselves and towards human persons. Animal persons do not act randomly or automatically, but also have purpose, intentionality. They are also capable of making choices. So animals are clearly sentient, they are persons. Of course, not all actions from the part of animals are with a clear interest in engaging with humans. Sometimes the engagement is not on purpose, by accident, or purely by not understanding the sense of space and limit the same way a human person understands. For instance, you have a flower in your window and a bee comes to engage with your flower. It's not purposely engaging with the human, but solely an engagement towards the purposes of the bee. Or a mouse is foraging in your garden, either because the mouse doesn't understand the conception of a human garden and simply understands a good place for foraging, or if the mouse is aware of these human creations, don't care about the fact that it's your garden and simply acts towards its own self-interest. However, some animals' actions are indeed purposely towards humans. They do engage with human persons at certain occasions, demonstrating willingness to communicate, demonstrating self-awareness and intention. Animals engage with each other, communicate with each other, even between different species. A human is just another animal in the eyes of animals. It's a human person with which they sometimes show willingness to communicate and want to engage with and even participate in certain human actions and events. So perhaps it is a fail in human observation. Perhaps humans are animals the same way that animals can see themselves as humans when they engage with humans. Because engagement between persons doesn't necessarily express more or less personhood. From the moment a person relates to another person, those persons see each other as the same. When there's an ongoing relationship between you and an animal, are you becoming more animal or is the animal becoming more human? Again, could be a fail in observation. And so there's no animal or human, but simply persons relating and communicating. We move on to plants and their personhood. I think it's relatively easy to understand that a plant is alive, especially by the consecutive scientific developments which clearly demonstrate that plants also express themselves in various ways similar to other beings such as humans. Although the manner in which they express themselves is considerably different than that of humans. But they do manifest more or less the same things, such as consuming, breathing, reproducing, growing. There's a certain level of sensibility as well. there's communication between plants, and even communication into the exterior that can be the result of interaction with other beings. Clearly, a plant is alive, and a plant has personhood and a certain level of consciousness. The interaction between human and plant in terms of engaging in a conversation may not be as productive as interactions between humans who receive knowledge from one another, or may not be as strong in building a relation and understanding the life form as we do with animals. But it does create information by observance of behavior and exploring on deeper levels the life of a plant and its cycles. A relation can be created with plants, although it is certainly more limited than a relation with an animal or another human being, from the part of human persons. In terms of animism, it is also understood that a plant contains spirit, and certain plants have a specific power which occasionally is necessary to obtain for the well-being of a human community. And the shaman of that community will try to communicate with the plant spirit in order to obtain that power from that plant spirit, from the plant spirit. And this engagement is crucial in animistic societies because the power that one wants to obtain from that plant can only be gathered if the spirit of the plant allows it and conserves it until the point of administration of that power in whichever context that same power is necessary. In this way, we understand personhood as well by the engagement of a human person with a plant person, bargaining and reasoning with the spirit of the plant so that the spirit may allow the extraction of its power residing in the plant itself. We can also, for instance, remember that many types of mushrooms create an underground network amongst themselves, which facilitates communication between themselves, but also communication with trees, and trees communicating with one another through their roots and through the network mushrooms created on such roots. Trees can nurture other young trees, especially of their own species. Trees certainly communicate better among themselves than they do with humans. But a communication between human and tree is also possible, although limited, because the ways both life forms choose to express themselves are quite different, and there are clear limitations. But communication is still possible to a certain extent. Many animistic indigenous communities do build close relationships with particular trees or communities of trees. What may seem an ordinary grove may be considered a special place to some people who have created a type of relationship with that place by interaction with the place. Some types of trees can even be honored, worshipped, prayed to, building entire human rituals and ceremonies towards specific trees. Such is the case of the concept of the world tree or the tree of life. Humans give gifts to some trees, and trees may gift humans as well. A particular person after death may be buried by the foot of a specific tree, and the descendants of that person carry on rituals towards the memory of the ancestor, creating a link between tree and ancestor, giving rise to ancestor cults to trees. A particular branch of a tree can be turned into a special item or utensil so that the human may use it as a tool to better communicate with unseen forces and invisible others, and with other than human and more than human populations of the world, by using that specific item or utensil as the link between two types of beings that require special ways to create communication with one another. All these examples and many more that have certainly crossed your mind to demonstrate that there are many forms of communication, even towards flora. Communication and even relationship can be created with plants. Doesn't matter if you believe in this or not. Many people believe, and so they will conduct their actions towards this belief and create communication and relation with plants. Therefore, the relationship is created and exists to those who have made the effort to create it. exchanges are made and relationships are created. And it is as simple as that. Not only relationships are created, they are maintained and they are celebrated. And all of this facilitates the understanding of the personhood of plants. From the moment a plant ceases to be a mere passive resource and instead an ongoing relationship with the plant has been established, that plant is important to those who have made a relationship with it, and therefore there's communication between persons. In animism, plants are engaged with as powerful persons, some of whom, just like animals, have their lives taken or parts of themselves for the benefit of other persons. Not necessarily only human persons, but other persons of the world. Now, the question here is, if plants are persons and we eat them, does that make us cannibals? Well, yes and no. This depends very much on the relationship we create with plants, which may not be as strong as the relationship we create with animals. For instance, the engagement with plant persons may be solely to use the plant merely as a consumable, not creating relationship, but simply engagement to acquire a beneficial aspect of the plant that becomes stronger precisely by the engagement we have with the plant. I'm saying plants, but this can also serve for types of psychotropic mushrooms. The entire engagement with certain psychotropic mushrooms and plants is to create a connection through ritual and ceremony, carrying out prayers and invocations towards the spirit of such consumables, and it is by that engagement that the powers of the consumables remain more active, and in this way certain mushrooms and plants are only to facilitate communication with others, especially to facilitate communication with a wider community of life. Let's take the example of tobacco, or better still, ayahuasca, since it has become such a famous consumable with hallucinogenic properties. Certainly, there's a certain level of influence upon one's mind when consuming it. It is inevitable due to its hallucinogenic properties. However, if you do not know how to communicate with the spirit or spirits of the plant that is used to make ayahuasca, the results will not be as strong because a previous relationship with the spirit of the plant wasn't created to allow the plant to retain its power and the very spirit aid you in the intended purpose upon consuming ayahuasca. We return to what I have said previously and the engagement with the spirit of the plant in order for the plant to retain the components that one wants to obtain. A plant used for healing by itself has some effects. However, the shaman will not simply use the plant for healing purposes, but also seeking out its spirit to bargain with it, ask for permission to aid in the process of healing. It's not just the natural components of the plant, but also trying to involve the very spirit of the plant in the process of healing to better conduct all the nutrients towards the healing process in order to successfully administrate healing. But in terms of a diet, this is quite different from eating an animal, obviously. Even though animals and plants both have personhood, let's be realistic and sensible about these things. As I said before, an animal in its corporeal constitution has a nervous system developed in a way that is capable of feeling and have more complex sentiments and sensations, while a plant does not. A plant may contain a spirit, may contain certain levels or a degree of consciousness, but its corporeal existence, its physical existence, doesn't have a nervous system developed in a way that can feel pain or indeed be self-aware to the point of feeling pain and screaming and feeling anything when the plant is eaten. Certainly, you can kill an animal and eat the animal, but should you, when there are other alternatives that do not suffer and do not feel pain? If the intention is purely nutrition, there are over 5,000 plants that will give you the same and even more and better nutrition than the animals people usually consume. Over 5,000 plant persons that are not self-aware and do not feel pain and do not feel suffering and can be consumed thus avoiding suffering, illness, damage, harm, and death. Again, the point here is minimizing as much harm and damage as possible whenever it is possible, being conscious about our attitudes. Certainly, other animals eat other animals, but we as humans, are we not humans after all, with a different biology and a corporeal form? A lion eats meat, but the lion has no other choice because the digestive system of a lion is quite different than that of a human, and it is built to eat meat, and there's no other choice. And even a lion, having no other choice but to eat meat, can still show signs of respect, empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another and avoid certain kills, as it has been documented many times. The human being, on the other hand, has a very different digestive system than that of a lion, which is actually built to be more predisposed towards a plant-based diet because we have evolved towards that. We can eat meat, but should we, or must we, when we have other choices and our system is built to be able to eat plants? Again, the lion has no other choice, and its system is built only to eat meat. But the humans are built to be able to eat plants. We have a choice, and we can survive and live well and healthy with a plant-based diet. Why should we choose to ignore a clear blessing of having a choice when other animals simply have no choice? Humans are actually lucky and fortunate as sentient beings because we can literally choose to have a diet free from causing harm, death, and cruelty and to other persons who want to live, freeing us from a sense of guilt, shame, and profound misery by killing another person to consume that person. It would be hard for us if we had no other choice, but we have. Again, it's no coincidence that indigenous animistic peoples are more predisposed to have a plant-based diet when they live in conditions that allows them to have that choice, and they go for that choice rather than killing and eating persons of the world. Which is also why in environments that do not allow a plant-based diet, there's no other choice for the human but to hunt, kill, and eat the flesh of another person of the world. But in such human cultures, there's a stronger and more developed sign of respect and mourning towards the person that was killed, and a greater development in ceremonies and rituals towards the person that was killed for the consumption and survival of the community. There's naturally guilt, regret, pain, sorrow for the killing of another life. And this is the basis of animism and veganism for that matter, which in fact the latter sprouts from animism. The basis, the very foundations, is precisely minimizing harm, damage, illness, and death as much as possible whenever it is possible. So, if we have better choices that certainly mitigate more negative aspects of life, why not choose them if it's there for us as alternatives? Let me put it this way. The house is on fire. Will you first save the cat or the house plant? Deep down you know the choice that will minimize as much damage and harm as possible. Some persons of the world have no choice, but we humans have. Between species we are built differently, but we, as humans, have clear choices, and some are better to mitigate the more cruel aspects of life. So why not go for those choices instead of simply remain on a path of selfishness for pure personal pleasure? It's not a question of being good or evil. It's a question of choosing the best way possible to minimize all the damage, harm, and death as much as possible. It's certainly very, very different, even in terms of animism, eating animal persons from eating plant persons. Even a child knows this. So many arguments against veganism is simply playing the fool on purpose for the sake of not doing the minimum effort or no effort at all to change towards a better outcome. Therefore, being selfish and only focusing on the illusion that one has rights over other lives instead of focusing on the obligations one has towards life and the preservation of life. We jump now to cannibalism in animism. If we understand personhood in animals and plants, and if we eat such persons, What exactly prevents us from eating human persons if they are also persons? How do we know if it's wrong or right to eat another human if the human is as much a person as any other living being? And why do we choose to eat certain persons and not others? Why some people eat a dog and others find it absolutely horrific, such an action? And why some eat a cow and others find it equally horrifying and even absolutely unholy? Persons are persons, so why aren't we eating human persons as well if we assume that we should eat meat? There's a thing called moral principles, which simply doesn't spontaneously burst out of thin air. It comes from something else. There's another important factor that is inherent in all living beings, and that is the capacity to relate. And when we relate, we find common grounds and astonishing similarities, and we build and develop the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Therefore, we start to relate to their feelings and sensations, and we are able to distinguish what are the wrong and right attitudes to have. Because if we know stabbing or burning our flesh hurts, others will feel the same way. If we know we want to live and don't want to be killed, others will feel the same way. This is called empathy, and this is what prevents us from doing even more harm to other living beings. Of course, this is extended or augmented or diminished according to the society we live in and which lives we relate to, and our perceptions of the worthiness of life, as well as how and why we distinguish animality and humanity, which are in fact relative points of view, depending on the culture we are inserted in. We are cultural products, of course, but are we not more than that? Are we not sentient beings capable of relational thoughts as well? Are we simply going to be products of a culture and products of a time period, or are we going to accept humanity and its cognitive capacities and start thinking for ourselves and refuse to be products and start building our own unique personalities and individualities? We don't have to be products of a society just to fit in and be accepted. There are plenty of choices that give us the opportunity to be better than what a specific society, culture and time demands of us, just to place us neatly in a shelf. The truth is, more often than not, we only eat what we eat due to culture, because virtually almost everything is edible, and we only make distinctions in what we should or shouldn't eat due to culture, turning physically edible persons into culturally inedible persons. But should we limit our actions to simply fit and follow culture, or should we think beyond culture and think about who we consume? This is the reason we humans do not eat humans, because it has been established that it is culturally inappropriate and goes against the moral principles of culture, because we relate to beings that are of our own species. So we understand them and we know the feelings behind each mind similar to ours. We better relate to those who look like us in their corporeal existence, which is why it gets easy or easier to eat those that do not look like us. And indeed, it even becomes easy to have very pejorative and intolerant attitudes towards those that, even though are from the same species, they are not quite like us. In some aspect we do not comprehend, or simply we do not accept because we can't relate, lessening our capacity to be rational. So, perhaps by now you understand that I am not using the term cannibalism in its shallow understanding of simply eating a human, but rather on a broader understanding of the term related to culture. Cannibalism is wrong. Most cultures have established that. Cannibalism is taboo. It goes against nature. As such, cannibalism came to determine the ultimate savagery a human being can inflict. A cannibal is often ostracized, and if caught in the act, can be imprisoned or killed, because culturally the cannibal is not like us. It is the other, someone we cannot relate to, because it goes against the moral principles we have established and demonstrates savagery, therefore cannot belong within the community. Cannibals are those we want to destroy because they express inhumanity. Therefore, they are not us, and we ought to destroy them, or at the very least imprison them or cast them away, because they define the end of a culture and go beyond that which is forbidden. Therefore they are anti-culture. This is why cannibalism is forbidden, because it is inhumane. So why are we cannibals towards animals who are also persons? Why do we eat them if it is inhumane? Some people could argue that there are ways around this and we can kill an animal person in humane ways. But notice how that sounds. Killing in humane ways. Let's ask ourselves this question. We are human beings. Can we kill a human in a humane way? Can we kill a person in a humane way? There's no such thing as killing in humane ways, because the act of killing and consuming the flesh of a person is inhumane. Is there a humane way to kill a human who doesn't want to die and just wants to live its life? No, of course not. Of course there isn't. Killing a life that doesn't want to be killed is already inhumane. So the same thing is applied to killing animal persons. As much as we try to find a humane way to kill an animal person, it will always be inhumane, because we are taking the life of a being that wants to live. To eat a person is to cease being a person. Therefore you become the cannibal. As such, you are inhumane. You become the representation of ultimate savagery, and so you become the other, the anti-culture, because you are not able to relate and others do not relate with you. However, the existence of cannibalism is precisely one of the things that helps us to be human and be better humans. Animals being persons, if we eat persons, it suggests that eating human persons is also acceptable. In a society that isn't able to relate to a person and eats that person, it demonstrates that there are more arguments and reasons in favor of being cannibal and eating humans than not. Whereas, if you have a plant-based diet, you avoid becoming cannibal. Again, plants are persons too, but let us be rational here. A plant isn't a sentient being, and the capacity to relate to a plant person is less strong than relating to an animal person. Because animals are sentient like us, humans, and are able to relate with us, and we with them. Because the physical structure has a nervous system that gives the ability for that life form to be self-aware and capable of feeling and have rational thoughts, and like us, also able to create communities and culture. Both animals and plants have spirit and consciousness, but plants are not sentient, and the spirit of the plant is not inhabiting a body that gives such spirit the ability to be self-aware and the ability to feel pain. And more often than not, in the case previously discussed, the contact with the spirit of a plant is often through the ingestion of that plant. While with the spirit of an animal, we can relate to it and contact with it simply by exchanging forms of communication with them that are simpler than those we might try with plants. This isn't even science and/or religion. This is just common sense. Still, the problem remains towards animal persons and the case of eating them, turning us into cannibals. In animistic societies, even those that eat animals, largely not as often as civilizations who depend so much on a meat industry, such animistic societies considered a problem eating animals, and when presented with the alternative of not killing and eating animals, they will take that alternative to avoid the problems of eating animals, who, after all, are not only seen as persons, but in many animistic societies, animals are seen as humans as well, because it depends very much on the perspective, and it's a relative perspective. Some animistic societies do not make a distinction or distinctions between animality and humanity due to relation. An animal might see itself as human, and a human might see itself as an animal. And through the relation between human and animal, a human may not feel more human or more animal, but simply understand that it is a person just like the person they are relating with. You see, animism has been often considered to be childish and irrational and unrealistic, But as you can see, it is highly complex and pushes people further into a broader scenery where problems of a society are augmented, extended, which forces people to find more and new ways to better ourselves, to be better humans, to be better persons of the world. This is why non-animistic societies conduct their actions towards an illusion of rights they think they have over someone else's life, while animistic societies focus on the obligations towards life and how better to minimize all the harm and damage, and illness and death. Animism is highly rational. And in my opinion, animism is the natural way of a human being to see the world, instead of hiding from the real problems that no matter what, they will still be there, waiting to be fixed, to challenge us to become better. So, of course, animism is quite difficult to deal with and even understand in some societies after centuries of denying the natural world and the position of the human being in the great cycle of life. As in such societies, it has been created a sense that the human being is superior as it was made in the image of a god, and therefore all other life forms must be subjected to the will of the human being and are here to serve the human being. Animism simply destroys all that view. And people are naturally drawn to animism because people are rational beings and have the capacity to relate. And by relating to others, we understand that no life form is above another. And the problems must be fixed by actually focusing on the problems and try to find ways to fix them as much as possible instead of going around them. We have to take into consideration types of cannibalism when there's no other choice, or rather, when the only choice available is either resort to cannibalism or die. Throughout history, we have accidents like shipwrecks, and people are stranded on a place without any food resources and have to resort to eating their dead companions. Or a city under siege, and all the food resources have been spent, and the ultimate means of sustenance to carry on living is to eat the dead. Or times of great famine. In European history, the Great Famine of the 19th century has forcibly created many cannibals all across Europe and Northern Asia. The great majority of these cases of cannibalism are not of humans that kill other humans in order to eat their flesh, but instead they wait for someone's death to eat their flesh because there's no other choice. Most of these cannibals, if they survive, later on show signs of remorse, shame, are clearly traumatized, and it is highly unlikely that they will become or continue to be cannibals when given other choices. The same thing is applied to those who kill and consume animals in animistic societies, although there are few exceptions, of course, such as consuming the flesh of an animal through ritual in order to receive the power of the animal or to propitiate something beneficial to the human community by the consumption of an animal other than simply for sustenance. But in the great majority of cases, the killing of an animal for sustenance is when there's no other choice available in terms of sustenance, because if other means of consumption are available that permit the human person to avoid killing another person of the world, that means of consumption is taken. Not only that, but the killing of an animal is often reserved to a specific group of the community, the hunters. Within most indigenous animistic societies, not everyone is permitted or even allowed to hunt. And so it is only the hunter that faces the problem of breaking taboo, thus minimizing culpability and shame and remorse within the community. The hunter is often conducted to the killing of an animal by the spiritual leader, the shaman, who seeks out either the spirit of the animal that is to be killed or bargains with more powerful other than human or more than human persons that govern over a territory or animals to send forth an animal willing to be sacrificed for the survival of the human persons. There's a conduct. There are a series of ceremonial and ritualistic steps because taking the life of a person isn't something positive to be glad about. There's often a ceremony towards the carcass or the bones of the chosen animal for the slaughter, not only as a sign of respect and gratitude for the sacrifice that led to the survival of the human community, but also often to avoid the spirit of the animal from being angry and seek revenge upon those who have killed him. And many hunting performances and even the extraction of meat on the spot lead to a series of behaviors from the part of the humans to try to deceive the spirit of the animal killed to avoid its wrath and taking revenge, such as the hunter dressing as another animal or imitating behaviors of various animals while extracting the meat, to make believe that the animal has been killed and being feasted upon by other animals and not by the humans. Spirits get angry for their untimely death or for having been killed when they wanted to live. And some may seek revenge or find revenge through more powerful spirits. So there are a series of activities to go around the taboo and to avoid a greater evil and greater damage and greater harm from the damage and harm that has already been done by killing an animal. But I'm not going to deal with death and hunting in animism on today's video. That stays for a future video, or we would be here for another hour. So again, it's no coincidence that veganism is more active in animistic communities, because when that choice is presented, it is taken, as it saves the human persons from remorse, culpability and trauma, and even saving from future harm caused by angry spirits and from the anger of other than human and more than human persons, such as ancestors, deities and spirits of great power that govern over a specific place, species or activity. The great majority of hunting activities throughout history in practically every civilization and culture that isn't immediately for the consumption of the meat in order to survive are activities linked to the warrior groups as a form of training and to harden the individual for future battles and to facilitate the killing of another. In many societies, young humans are led or have been led to the killing of a pet dog in order to take the innocence out of them. In medieval Europe, among the knights' caste, boar hunt was training for young warriors to get used to the killing of a life and feeling what it's like to end a life and to penetrate the flesh of a living being and get used to the blood and gore and life being snuffed out forever. Basically, these hunting activities are to introduce humans into violence and normalize violence so they can do and perpetuate such violence. So there it is, again, the killing of an animal is violence, understood as violence, taken as violence to perpetuate savagery within the human community as a means of control of territories and resources between humans. Again, it's clearly for the wrong reasons. And again, these activities are perpetuated due to cultural standards, normalizing violence to the point of becoming tradition, and keep doing wrong because most people are the products of their culture and will seldom think about their actions because it was normalized, and it simply feels normal because people have been doing it for centuries. Just because we do something for ages doesn't mean it is right. It just means it has been normalized. The same way a culture feels normal the killing of a cow, and another culture feels that that attitude is absolutely savage and ignorant, but are okay doing something else that another culture also feels it is wrong. Normalizing something within a culture doesn't mean that it is right. And normalizing violence through the killing of innocent animals for the sake of nothing but to create monsters that are able to break relation with a life form, and thus it's easier to take life in sceneries of conflict and war, isn't normal either. War isn't normal. War isn't natural. War is a fail in the human cognitive capacities. No other animal on the planet wages war. War is a human thing, and it isn't natural. Anyway, returning to cannibalism, you may be thinking, well, certainly some societies have normalized cannibalism even for religious or spiritual purposes. The consumption of their dead as a form of compassion or to facilitate the release of their spirits, or to acquire their power, or to facilitate the process of transformation so they can be reborn within the community. But all these attitudes do not seek to obtain sustenance or protein. And eating human flesh in such cases is not because human meat is needed for survival or indeed for sustenance, but a cultural aspect. Almost every case such as this is the consumption of what is already dead and didn't die by the hands of those who are consuming the flesh, which is the same thing as most of our societies do nowadays. When people consume meat, they are not the ones killing, but are paying for another to kill for them, to avoid having to deal with the problem of the killing of those they can relate with. Not only that, but more often than not, we eat animals because it is a cultural thing, and we have normalized it because we have established that meat is necessary for sustenance when it isn't. In most cases, we only eat animals the same way certain cultures eat their human dead, because of culture and not necessity. But we, as rational beings, are we really going to keep pushing further our heads into the soil and avoid the problem and going around taboo to satiate our pleasure? Or are we going to face the problems and try to find ways and better ways to mitigate the pain, anguish, cruelty and death that is inflicted on thousands of animals on a daily basis and millions of animals every year? As I pointed out, some forms of cannibalism on human flesh in certain societies is for religious purposes and not because of the need to seek sustenance and protein. The same thing is applied to the consumption of animals. If it's solely for sustenance and protein, it can easily be avoided with a plant-based diet that can also serve the same purpose, giving sustenance and protein, and one avoids destroying a life. If the killing and consumption of an animal is for religious and spiritual purposes, then it's not for survival and it isn't a need, but simply for personal selfish gain, which can also be avoided if the person doesn't conduct a life towards personal gain and to satiate greed, and instead conducts a life focusing on the obligations towards life and not on the rights over another life. And that is no longer cultural, but it depends on each person's consciousness and moral principles. Again, we don't have to be products of our cultures. We can very well think past that and seek to become better individuals. Surely it may have crossed your mind the case of animal sacrifice in past societies for religious and spiritual purposes. All right, but just because our ancestors did it, that doesn't mean they were right and doesn't mean we should continue to do that. In fact, those actions have largely stopped because we have evolved as a society. We also used to sacrifice children by drowning and chopping them up into pieces to give to the gods. And in the great majority of every pocket of modern human societies, this isn't done anymore. We also used to die at the age of 30, even younger than that. But medicine evolved, and so did our daily habits. Things change. Evolution is inevitable, and humanity is ever walking towards a period that can be better than the previous one. Culture changes, culture evolves, and traditions are meant to evolve. There's no need whatsoever to perpetuate certain attitudes that no longer make sense, no longer make any sense. Animism doesn't only force people to think about humanity and our conduct as humans. Animism forces human persons to think about obligations and notions of culture, personhood, animality, humanity, nature, relation, kinship, and so on and so forth. Because reality doesn't revolve around humanity, but it revolves around a great variety of factors that compose life, in which humanity is just one branch. Without animism, we are just considering a branch of an entire tree we choose to ignore, so we may live our lives in a selfish way towards personal greed and enslave and destroy others' lives purely to satiate our pleasure. In terms of cannibalism, we eat who we eat simply because each culture not only has established specific distinctions between animal persons and human persons, but also because the distinctions between food persons and other kinds of persons, or rather what we have established to be culturally edible persons and culturally inedible persons. It's surely a question of points of perspective, which is good because it means such perspectives can be altered and changed if we strive to walk towards a better future where it is possible to minimize even more the damage and harm we cause. Most forms of cannibalism either exist because it's a religious idea, which can be avoided since it's not directed to the need of survival and seek out sustenance. Or it exists as a form of sustenance and survival when there's no other choice, right? But having other choices, better choices, choices that save us from causing harm and damage and from perpetuating and normalizing violence, why not take those choices if they continue to give us what we need the most to continue to be alive? When we eat animal persons, more often than not, we do so because we have established that some persons are food and others are not. And we create clear boundaries in order to avoid relation, to avoid remorse and sorrow. But why do we understand some can be eaten and others can't? There's no natural law that dictates that a life can be killed and eaten and another can't. These boundaries are purely human creations based on perspectives fermented by culture and what a culture thinks to be appropriate to eat or not. It's pure illusion based on the limited relations we want to establish with the persons of the world. What we eat doesn't revolve around a natural law. It revolves around what we have established to be appropriate to eat according to each culture we are inserted in. It is human choice, nothing more. Therefore, each individual has a choice and what they eat is purely by choice. Therefore, it's up to each individual's consciousness and how each individual wants to deal with responsibilities and obligations towards life. As I said before, veganism leads to animism and animism leads to veganism, precisely because both offer a lot more alternatives to try to solve problems that seem to be unsolvable. But they only seem that way because we often put humanity at the center instead of seeing humanity as a small part of a broader reality where every person of the world can relate, communicate, and therefore each has obligations towards life. Animism, just like veganism, offers alternatives to minimize as much as possible the harm and damage we all do for the simple fact of being alive and trying to continue on living. I think we should live with a conscious mind towards our relation with life and our obligations towards the preservation of life instead of focusing on what or how life can serve us. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed today's video. I hope it was useful. Let me know in the comments. For this one, I will try to answer as much questions as I can. I will even try to take a day off. I'm not promising anything, but I will try to answer your questions and doubts concerning this subject, especially concerning veganism and animism as well, and cannibalism. Anyway, once again, and as always, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video and tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Farewell.